Hi everyone, my name is Nabila Wilson, and today I'm going to be talking about the environmental indigenous movement in Bolivia, specifically surrounding the TIPNIS highway conflict and how I analyzed it using the donut model and world systems theory. In 2011, a major protest march began in Bolivia against a proposed highway through a national park and indigenous territory known as TIPNIS. More than 1,700 protesters ultimately traveled about 375 miles to oppose the road. They argued that it would open the territory to deforestation, extractive industries, and outside settlement.
También por su parte el gobierno de que su interés también es de construir la carretera y empezar a hacer exploraciones de pozos petroleros, porque él sabe de que hay petróleo y en fin otras cosas. Eso también él quiere matar nuestras tierras, pues no, porque sabemos de que con el petróleo donde se derrama líquido van muriendo toda clase de seres vivos, pero los compañeros que están a favor del presidente no piensan todo eso, pues no, lo que ellos piensan es recibir dinero.
What made this protest especially significant is that these largely indigenous protesters were challenging Evo Morales, Bolivia's first ever indigenous president. Under Bolivia's constitutional framework, communities like TIPNIS were supposed to be given free, prior, and informed consent before any major development projects like a highway could happen. But in this case, that consultation didn't happen because Morales argued that his government was indigenous and therefore he could make decisions for the indigenous people. This event spurred the question of my video. How did a movement that resulted in the election of the country's first ever indigenous president then end up protesting that same leader? To answer that question, I'm using Raworth's donut economic model and world systems theory. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the protests, let's make sure that we understand the theory. The donut model describes sustainability and how to achieve a safe and just space for humanity. On the inside are the social foundations. These are things like food, water, housing, political voice, things that humans need for their own well-being. On the outside, we have the planetary boundaries or environmental limits, like climate change and ocean acidification. These are lines that we don't want to cross for fear that they'll set off tipping points and disrupt the major life-supporting systems of our planet. The goal of the donut is to find the balance between these two rings, to meet human needs without destroying the environment. And this is where the story becomes a bit more complicated, because even within the same movement, people experience these pressures differently, depending on where they lived or how they made money. One of the most important ideas in the donut model is that the environmental limits and the social foundations are not separate. When environmental conditions are damaged, social conditions often get worse. For example, droughts or floods can reduce food production and make it harder for people to meet basic needs like water and housing. But the relationship also works in the opposite direction. Policies that improve living conditions can sometimes create environmental problems. For example, fertilizer helps to increase food production around the world, resulting in the strengthening of the social foundations by reducing hunger. It's a good thing, it helps people. But fertilizer runoff is also a big problem. It ends up in ecosystems and waterways and can end up hurting the plants and animals that live there. So the challenge is not simply choosing development or environmental protection. The challenge is figuring out how to improve people's lives without causing environmental damage that will eventually go back to hurt those same people. Because humans and the environment are not separate. We live on this planet. Anything that hurts the environment will always end up hurting us in the end. Whether that's more literally with climate change causing natural disasters, or with the fertilizer runoff example that I said earlier, that could cause less fish, less things to eat, or chemicals getting into the water, which can then poison us or our food sources. It always will come back to us because we live on this earth. Another important part of the donut model is understanding where we currently stand. Scientists have identified 9 major planetary boundaries that keep Earth's systems stable. These are the environmental limits on the outside of the ring of the donut. When Rayworth first put out the donut model, she predicted we had crossed about 3 of the planetary boundaries. However, the recent 2025 report predicts that we've crossed about 6 out of the 9. Basically, environmental pressures are increasing, and rapidly. The boundaries that we had crossed doubled in the span of just 13 years. Okay, tangent aside, let's go talk about Bolivia. The other theory I use to analyze this case study is Wallerstein's world systems theory. This is the idea that the periphery countries, typically those in the global south, export their raw materials to the core countries, typically those in the global north. In return, the core countries sell high-value manufactured goods back to the periphery countries. The result of this relationship is that the periphery is completely reliant on the core for manufactured goods and money. Basically, the core gets to get wealthy, while the periphery is slowly hurting their environment through extractivism. Before we get into how all of this happened, I think it would be helpful for a little bit of context to know just a tad about Bolivia. First of all, it's a very small country. There are only about 11 million people, but about 40 to 60% of those people are estimated to be indigenous. Bolivia is also one of the poorest and most unequal countries in Latin America. This is rooted in their history with colonialism, extractive industries, and austerity measures. Okay, let's get into this. To really understand Evo Morales, let's first look at the history that allowed for his election. In the 1980s and 1990s, Bolivia adopted neoliberal economic policies that privatized public services, reduced government spending, and opened the economy to foreign corporations. This resulted in rising poverty and inequality, and many communities lost access to essential services. Water became more expensive, healthcare became harder to access, and jobs became less stable. Using the donut model, we can see that people were losing access to basic necessities. In other words, they were falling below the social foundations. These economic changes created widespread frustration, especially among indigenous and rural communities who were already marginalized. So, people began to organize. In 2000, the government privatized the water system in the city of Cochabamba. Almost immediately, water prices increased and families were struggling to pay their bills.
Almost 10 years have passed since April 2000 when the famous water war took place in Cochabamba. This popular mobilization that expelled the water company Aguas del Tunari, whose main shareholder was the American multinational Bechtel, has been a world symbol of resistance against the privatization of water.
So farmers, workers, students, families all took to the streets. They demanded control over water, and after months of protest, the government finally reversed the privatization.
After Bechtel left Bolivia, the administration of water returned to the hands of the state company CEMAPA, whose main mission included bringing water to the neighborhoods of Cochabamba that do not have water service.
This was one of the first major victories for social movements in Bolivia. It showed people that collective action could produce real change. In terms of the donut model, the water war was about protecting a basic social foundation. When that foundation was threatened, people mobilized. Just a few years later, protests erupted again, this time over natural gas.
Están viniendo con balas los policías, armas de fuego están manejando, ya no miran a quién, así que...
And so the protests became massive. Roads were blocked, cities virtually shut down, and eventually 2 different presidents were forced to resign. These protests were not just about economics. They were largely about control. People wanted to decide how their country's resources were being used. Using the donut model, we can see that Bolivia had natural resources, but those resources weren't being used to strengthen the social foundations of the common people. Instead, wealth was leaving the country while poverty remained. The people realized this, and so they fought back. This continuous unrest, growing strength of social movements, and distrust of foreign neoliberal policies finally led to the election of Evo Morales in 2006, the country's first ever indigenous president. Morales himself was a labor organizer. He has his background working with peasants, women groups, the indigenous people, other unions to make change, and that organizing allowed for his election. It was a historic day, and thousands gathered to watch Morales get inaugurated. Morales appeared in ceremonial indigenous dress and participated in traditional rituals alongside indigenous spiritual leaders. Observers described a feeling of collective euphoria, some people even crying. For many people, this felt like centuries of exclusion finally coming to an end. There was a lot of hope. People believed that the government would strengthen those social foundations, focus on indigenous rights, and finally improve those living conditions. It felt like the indigenous movement had finally won, but success created a new challenge. Governments have to manage budgets, negotiate with industries, and respond to economic pressures. And that leads to a difficult question. When social movements succeed in electing their leaders, do they really become stronger? Or do they maybe lose some of their independence? Some scholars argue that when movements enter government, they risk being absorbed into the state. Leaders who once challenged the system now become responsible for maintaining it. And once movements enter government, it can be harder for them to resist policies that they once opposed. Basically, they can become co-opted. Because now, the indigenous movement holds the highest seat of power in the government. Morales' presidency really brought to light the division within the indigenous movement. Because once you enter government, you have to manage competing priorities and complex decisions. This division is shown quite clearly through the TIPNIS highway. Morales is now president, and he's trying to build a highway through a forest. He says that he doesn't need the permission of the locals because he himself is indigenous, and so he knows what's in their best interest. Why would Morales go against the people who elected him to enact such a large infrastructure project? For one, Morales faced limits beyond his control. This is where world systems helps to explain the situation. This structure originated in colonialism and imperialism and is a hard one to break free from. It means that countries like Bolivia rely heavily on resource extraction to generate revenue. And this revenue is often what they use to fund social programs, infrastructure, and public services. So, governments face a difficult choice. They need economic growth to strengthen the social foundations, but the most accessible path to growth often involves extracting natural resources. And extraction can push ecosystems towards environmental limits. This is the tension that sits at the center of the donut model. The people protesting this decision were worried about potential pollution and destruction of natural areas in the TIPNIS forest if this highway were built. They were worried about the planetary boundaries. The goals of both Morales and the protesters were important. The question then becomes, why were these indigenous people disagreeing about what was more important? This is because, despite Bolivia being quite a small country, there's a wide range of living situations and regional experiences that really shape people's beliefs. Basically, indigenous identity is not uniform. Some indigenous groups live more in the forest region, where daily survival depends more on land and ecosystems. So, for them, the environmental boundaries are more important.
Donde nosotros estamos recibiendo el aire puro, ¿no? Realmente los árboles, donde nosotros nos alimentamos, ¿no? Ahorita el territorio, ¿no? Entonces, donde nosotros podemos ir a cazar, ¿no? Y así para mantener a nuestra familia, a nuestros hijos, porque verdaderamente la carne nosotros no lo compramos, sino vamos y buscamos en el monte.
Other indigenous groups live in urban or mining regions. This means that development can lead to jobs, income, and stability, all things that help the social foundations. Some of these groups even supported the highway.
We are cattle ranchers and want to produce wheat to be farmers, but it hurts us that when we try to take our opportunities to connect with the rest of the country, voices of opposition are raised.
Successive Bolivian governments have promised the road they said would bring jobs and development, would cut journey times and get produce to markets. They never delivered. President Evo Morales says he will.
Quiere llegar con sus productos a los mercados del Asia y para ello Brasil requiere la carretera interoceánica y precisamente esta carretera interoceánica que comunique el Atlántico con el Pacífico se interrumpe en Bolivia porque no tenemos el tramo que falta y el tramo que falta precisamente es el tramo Villa Tunari-San Ignacio de... Ahora, también se dice, y esto no debo ocultarlo, ¿no?, que esa carretera también permitiría la posibilidad de facilitar el transporte de sustancias no controladas, ¿no? En este caso hablo de manera muy puntual de cocaína.
Indigenous identity alone does not determine political views. Material conditions, economic needs, and geography really matter as well. In the donut model, different communities were prioritizing different parts of the same system. Some focused on protecting those environmental limits, while others were more focused on strengthening the social foundations. Both perspectives were rational and rooted in survival. Supporters believed the highway would bring development, improve transportation, economic opportunity, and access to services. But opponents feared environmental destruction, worrying about deforestation, outside settlement, and loss of indigenous land.
De este proyecto de la carretera serían bastante devastadores a los ecosistemas de este lugar que es bastante frágil. Inicialmente habría efectos directos lo que se refiere a las fuentes de agua, ¿no? El otro factor que también estaría afectando es el factor suelo. Esto un poco por las actividades mismas de movimiento de tierra de la carretera y principalmente por los asentamientos que van a venir después de la construcción de la carretera. No olvidemos que esta área, toda la Amazonía, está considerada como un pulmón de la región y por lo tanto estos bosques lo que hacen es purificar el aire. Entonces al eliminar estos bosques, ya a través de esta carretera y a través de los asentamientos que van a venir y a través también de la ampliación de los cultivos, estaría eliminando todo lo que es la biodiversidad del bosque.
Por eso que nosotros precisamente ahorita no estamos de acuerdo, ¿no?, junto de la carretera. Sí no estamos en contra de la carretera, pero que pase por otro lado, que no pase por dentro del TIPNIS.
So, what does this story actually tell us about social movements? One of the biggest lessons is that they are complicated and not monolithic. Even when people share an identity, like the indigenous identity, they don't always share the same priorities, because priorities are shaped by life experience and geography. Neither side was irrational, and neither side was completely wrong or right. Leaders are not monolithic either. Evo Morales was not simply choosing development over the environment. He was trying to strengthen the social foundations in a country where many people still lacked basic necessities. At the same time, he was located within a global economic system that limited Bolivia's options to gain money and pushed governments towards resource extraction whether they wanted to or not. That doesn't mean every decision he made was correct, but it does mean those decisions were shaped by real constraints, not just ideology. So the conflict over TIPNIS was not just about one highway. It was about competing visions of development and the difficulty of balancing social needs and environmental protection, especially in a country with limited economic choices. And it shows that when social movements gain power, the struggle doesn't disappear, it just changes. It becomes more complex, more political, and honestly, sometimes more difficult, because governing means choosing between priorities that are all important, and sometimes those priorities clash. And this is exactly what the donut model helps us to see. Not a simple right or wrong answer, but a system of trade-offs, shifting pressures, and competing needs that are all constantly shifting. The TIPNIS highway protesters won. They never built the highway. But that doesn't mean that all was well with the indigenous people in Bolivia. Bolivia is often considered one of the best countries for indigenous rights, because on paper it is. The Constitution enshrines the sovereignty and independence of the indigenous people, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect. Morales' fall from power is complicated and surrounded by conflict. We don't have time to get into it today, but I would highly recommend that you look it up. If you take away one thing from this video, I want it to be for you to always ask why someone is doing something. People don't often act just out of what they want. It's often shaped by those global economic systems or different priorities. In the wise words of George Washington from the Hamilton musical,
winning was easy, young man. Governing's hard.
They're being intransigent.
You have to find a compromise.
But they don't have a plan. They just hate mine.
Convince them.
In Bolivia, environmental pressures are not hypothetical. They are already affecting people's daily lives. Climate change has contributed to floods in some regions and long droughts in others. At that same time, glaciers that once reliably provided fresh water every year are now melting rapidly. This means they're not going to come back and be able to provide water. These changes threaten water supply for both rural and urban communities. And what makes this especially important is that the people most affected are often those with the fewest resources to adapt. Communities living in rural or forest regions often depend directly on the land for food, water, and to make a living. When environmental systems become unstable, their livelihoods are immediately at risk. Environmental damage never stays in the environmental ring. It always ends up affecting the social one. And this helps explain why development decisions in Bolivia are so difficult. Leaders are not just choosing between protecting nature or protecting the economy. They're responding to real risks that are already unfolding. This makes the challenge of balancing development and environmental protection even more urgent, and especially for countries in the global south. Many of these countries are still working to improve living conditions, but they're doing so in a world already under environmental pressures, and it's not fair. The countries that are most responsible for climate change, those in the global north, are also going to be the least affected because they have the most money to mitigate and adapt, versus countries in the global south, which are not putting out as many fossil fuels and CO2 emissions, will be the most affected. Partially because of geography and where those countries are, but also because they don't have as much money to adapt to the changing climate and extreme weather. It gets into something super complicated, which is the fact that we need to decrease our carbon emissions, point blank, if we want to decrease the rapid onset of climate change. But can we, and I'm talking for myself here, as someone who lives in the US, someone who lives in one of the wealthiest countries on this earth, how can I ask a country that is still developing, and the reason for that being because my country or other countries in the global north at one point colonized them or has them in a form of modern-day economic imperialism, which has not allowed their country to develop. How could I possibly ask them to not develop the same way that I have and increase their own social foundations simply because of a problem that I created? But even though it's a problem I created, everyone on this planet will be affected because, again, we all live on this earth. It's a complicated issue and not what this video is about. The answer is definitely that the global north countries need to give money to the countries in the global south, especially islands, which are going to be affected first and already being affected. There are already places that are uninhabitable because of sea level rise. We need to be giving billions of dollars because this is a problem that we created, that they had nothing to do with, but they are going to suffer for, and we need to take responsibility for that. And that was my video on the indigenous environmental movement in Bolivia. I have put all of the resources and articles I used to compile the information in this video down below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an absolutely splendid rest of your day.